Did you know that the British briefly occupied Manila during the 17th century, and if things went differently at the time, then the British could have colonised the Philippines? Hi, welcome to this channel. In today's video we're going to be looking at some differences about the Philippines if they were colonised by the British. Now, please don't take this video too seriously, this is just for fun, and I'm not trying to romanticise colonisation. Obviously that's a really bad thing, and the Philippines would be much better off if they were never colonised by any country, whether it was the Spanish, British, Americans, Japanese. They're much better off independent. But since the Philippines could have been colonised by Britain, it might be interesting to look at some possible differences about the country. Also, I must state that I'm not a historian, I'm just a British person, so might have some insight on what the Philippines might be like. The British did occupy Manila from 1762 to 1764. This was during the time when there was many disputes over territories with the European superpowers at the time, and then they resolved this with a status quo where there was to be no major differences with the territories of each country, meaning that the British were ordered to leave Manila and leave it with the Spanish. And as you can probably imagine, the British did have resistance from the Filipinos as well as the Spanish, and some of the Filipinos were even supporting the Spanish to go against the British. So it wouldn't have been easy for Britain to take over the Philippines, but if they hadn't been ordered out of Manila, we all know what the British Empire was like. The British definitely would have tried to have a go at colonising the Philippines. And if they did, it would have been around the mid-17th century. So that's kind of the timeline where we're starting this video from, meaning that the Philippines would have still been colonised by the Spanish before the British took over. Bear that in mind with the video. So let's get into the differences. The first difference is that it's really unlikely that America would have ever occupied the Philippines. There's two big reasons why. The first is that America was able to take the Philippines from Spain because the Spanish Empire was crumbling. The Philippines was an easy target for the Americans. There was a few other Spanish colonies left over as the Spanish Empire was crumbling, and then America tried to take them all. There was Cuba, there was Puerto Rico, and then the Philippines. And America was able to take these countries from Spain, not because America was really powerful at the time, but mainly because the Spanish Empire was completely crumbling. Often American history books like to teach us that they freed the Philippines, but in reality what they did is they stole it from a weak country that was crumbling. Now, it's not good to be anti-American or anything like that, because Americans today don't have anything to do with what happened then, and then America has done some good to the Philippines since then, but that's how it started, that's how America took the Philippines. Whereas Britain, during the same time when America did take the Philippines, was really strong. Unlike Spain, they had a really strong empire at the time. Britain at the time, you could argue, was stronger than America, which is different nowadays because obviously Britain's a lot weaker than it used to be, but back then it was really strong, and America would have had a hard time going against the British. So America probably wouldn't have been able to take their territory. And then the second reason is that even back then, America and Britain were close allies, so it wouldn't make sense two close allies arguing. They wouldn't try and take each other's territory. America would have left Britain to have their own territory as they were allies. Because of those two reasons, it's really unlikely that America would have ever occupied the Philippines. The second difference about the Philippines is that they probably would drive on the left-hand side of the road. If you look at a map of countries that drive on the left-hand side of the road, you can definitely see a trend with most of these countries being former British colonies. And obviously the UK, of course, drives on this side of the road, so it makes sense that they made the countries that they colonised drive on the same side as the road as they do. There are some exceptions to this. Japan also drives on the left, but for the most part, most of these countries were former British colonies, and most likely the Philippines would also drive on this side of the road if the Brits had control over them. The next difference would be the language and accents of Filipinos. Most Filipinos would probably speak more British English compared to American English that they speak now. I mean, let's face it, Americans influenced the Philippines a lot with their language and their accents. And if you look at any Asian countries, probably in the Philippines, Filipinos have the closest accent to what Americans have. But if it was Britain in control of the Philippines, then they'll probably sound a lot more British with their accents. More like Indians, they sound more British. It's also possible as well that more Filipinos would speak Spanish, because remember, the Spanish still would have colonised the Philippines before Britain. The British preferred working within existing institutions, meaning that they would have made less effort than the Americans did to make Filipinos speak English. But it's still likely that Filipinos would speak more British English, or possibly even have a British accent, which seems hard to believe, Filipinos not having American English. But it could have happened if America never took over and if it was Britain instead. The fourth difference about the Philippines is that they would be part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is an association of countries that have had a history being involved with the British Empire, including Britain. There are 54 countries in the Commonwealth, and it would have been 55 if the Philippines were colonised by Britain. This would mean that the Philippines would compete in the Commonwealth Games. These take place every 4 years, just like the Olympics, and they're similar to ASEAN Games as well. So the Philippines would play in the Olympics, ASEAN Games and Commonwealth Games as well. And then because of this, Philippines might have close ties with other Asian countries that were also colonised by Britain. Another difference is that the Philippines probably would have had a different flag and would have had a Union Jack in the top left-hand corner of their flag, like many other countries in the Commonwealth. The Philippines would have got independence eventually from the British, and then probably after this, or sometime after their independence, they would have changed their flag again, similar to countries like South Africa and Canada, who have changed their flag to remove the Union Jack. But then saying that, some countries have kept it, like Australia and New Zealand. So Philippines could have still had a Union Jack in their flag, and definitely would have at some point in their history if they were colonised by the Brits. The sixth difference about the Philippines is that they would have a Prime Minister instead of a President. A President usually refers to the head of state of a country that's a republic, just like the Philippines is now. That's why they've got President Duterte and not Prime Minister Duterte. Whereas if they were colonised by the British, they would have a Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister is the leader of a government of a country that has a monarchy, where the King or Queen is the head of state. In this case with Britain, the Queen is the head of state. There are currently 15 countries that still have the Queen as the head of state. You can see the list of countries here if you're interested. So even after the Philippines would have got independence, they could have still had the Queen as the head of state. So this would mean that they would have a Prime Minister. Now, sticking with the Queen being head of state, this would lead to another difference, and that's the currency. With the Queen being the head of state, on the currency you'd have her head on it. I'll give you an example here. So this is a £10 note, and it's got the Queen's head. This is similar with other countries that have the Queen as the head of state, like Canada and Australia. They also have similar notes with the Queen's head on it, and the Philippines would be the same. There are other countries that are former British colonies that have removed the Queen from being the head of state, so then they've changed their currency, they removed the Queen from their notes and their coins. But the Philippines could have kept this even after they became independent. But even if they did get rid of this, there would have been some point in their history where they did have this, and where they did have the King of England or Queen, whoever it was at the time, being their head of state if they were colonised by the British. The next difference about the Philippines is that they would probably have different popular sports. It's really unlikely that basketball would be popular there, because that was introduced by Americans to Filipinos, whereas basketball isn't very popular with the British, so it's unlikely that they would have introduced that. Instead, they would have encouraged Filipinos to play sports that the Brits are interested in, like cricket, rugby and football. It's likely that cricket could have been popular in the Philippines, because if you look at some other Asian countries that the British colonised, cricket became really popular in those countries. Although saying that, it might be hard for Filipinos to find the space to play that, so they might have popularised other sports instead. We don't know, but it's unlikely that it would have been basketball. The final difference we're going to be looking at is that Mindanao would be a lot more separate to the rest of the Philippines than it currently is. It's even possible that it could have been a different country. This is because when Spain was in control of the Philippines, they didn't always have the most control over Mindanao. They struggled to gain control of certain parts and failed to influence Mindanao religiously. Whereas when the Americans were in control, they were able to take over Mindanao more so than the Spanish did. So because of this, there was an influx of more Christians than there was before. And nowadays there's a higher percentage of Christians in Mindanao than there ever was before. Whereas if it was the British instead of the Americans, Britain preferred working within existing institutions. And that's another reason why it could have even been a separate country, because of how different it was to the rest of the Philippines, because it didn't really have Catholicism there and it had different cultures there. So it could have been a different country. But even if it was still part of the Philippines, it would be a lot more different. The simplest way I'll put it, it would be like all of Mindanao would be like the autonomous region that they have now. But it wouldn't just be the Muslim autonomous region of Mindanao, it would be the whole of Mindanao that's like that. So Davao would be included with that, and there wouldn't really be many Christians there at all, and the Muslims would completely outnumber any other religion in Mindanao. So those were 9 possible differences about the Philippines if Britain colonized them. I don't know if all of these would have definitely happened, but it's likely that the Philippines would be a lot more different than it is now, even after independence. You definitely can't say that the Philippines would be better off if they were colonized by Britain, because many former British colonies didn't end up in a good state. So it's not good wishing that Britain colonized the Philippines, because that wouldn't have been a good thing. But it's definitely worth thinking about if it did happen, because it was possible where Britain could have taken control of the Philippines during the time when they had their occupation in Manila. It didn't go any further than it did because of political reasons and because of resistance that they had, but it could have happened and the Philippines could be different to what it is now. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and the differences that we've looked at. If you did, please give it a like, and if you want to see more content from this channel, please subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.